أهلا وسهلا فيكم ببدوي تريدز مثل كل مرة اليوم رح نقول لكم كلمة جيروم باول بعد انتهاء اجتماع اللجنة الفيدرالية للسوق المفتوح تم إعلان عن تثبيت الفايدة على الأرقام اللي هي موجودة عليه. هذا المتوقع، ما في شيء غريب بالموضوع. ثبتوها. هلا بدنا ننتظر الكلمة لنشوف شو رح يكون تأثيرها على السوق. خلينا بس نشوف شوية كومنتس حاليا. بوم. أهلا وسهلا فيك قمر. بلاك ميرس ساسدين، هلو أهلا. كيف الجميع؟ بدأ البث هلأ، صراحة تأخرت دقيقتين، كان عم بظبط شي بالإعدادات. أكيد ينعاد على بيتكم بالسلامة. زكريا بشكرك على الدعم الدائم من أحد السبسكرايبرز للقناة اليوتيوب، بيدعمني بشكل دائم. آه، أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. أنا وعم بتطلع اليوم صراحةً، هلأ وعيت من النوم، البلد اللي أنا فيه الساعة 5 وجه الضوء. آآ طلع في قضية طلعت لSafe Moon. طلع شكلهم طلع عم كانوا عم يعملوا نصب على العالم. خلّيني بس نطلع نشوف Safe Moon crashes the SEC charges Steam with committing fraud. الSEC عمل قضية ضد عملة Safe Moon، هي meme coin. أنا بتعرفني دايمًا ضد الmeme coins. هبط سعرها 30% بعد ما الSEC قال إنه الفريق عم يعمل تنصيب، عمليات تنصيب. قُلت بس لأخبركم هالأمر صار إذا كنتم حاملينها. على الأرجح انتهت العملة. امبارح لفت لي نظري كمان، بتذكروا حكيت لكم بالفيديو امبارح عن كيف متوقع سعر البيتكوين يلامس ال35,000 ويرجع يرتد شوي. لمسناه. ليه قلت لكم أنا ليه؟ لأنه كنت بشوف مراكز تصفيات كتير مهمة على هيدا المجال، على ال35,000 بكوين جراس إذا ماني غلطان. آه، نفرجيكم إياها. في مراكز تصفيات مهمة وهالشي. تم تثبيت الفايدة، نعم. ليش السوق طلع؟ هلا أهلا وسهلا فيك. نعم، حكينا إنه تم تثبيت الفايدة. هلا بانتظار المؤتمر الصحفي. المؤتمر الصحفي ببلش بعد تقريبا 15 دقيقة. سولانا طايرة، صح. سولانا وصلت ل $44. حكيت لكم امبارح، لا عن جد امبارح كانت بعدها بالأربعينات. قلت لكم عنها. في كتير أخبار جيدة على السولانا. آه هذا أمر كتير جيد. أخبار حكيت لكم عنهم كلّها. عاملين شراكات مع جوجل كلاود، بلّشت مع أمازون ويب سيرفيسز. عاملين أمور لتخلّي الألعاب تزيد بسرعة، المطوّرين يطوّروا ألعاب بطريقة أفضل. في كتير أخبار إيجابية عن الSolana وحكيت عنّا. التصفية التصفية جد اللي بدي إياها صراحةً. هلّأ عم ن هيدي هون قُلت لكم إياها، كانت امبارح حكيت لكم عنّا أنا. كان هون الأصفر الغامق كان موجود بمناطق على ال35,000 وشوي. شكله تم الوصول لهيدا الهدف وتصفيته. امبارح literally حكيت لكم عنّه، وهيدا اللي صار. شفنا صعود ورجعنا هبوط. anyways شو في أخبار غير؟ بشكرك تكنولوجيا. إن شاء الله أنتم بغزة بخير صراحةً مع كل القصف، كل الأمور، إن شاء الله صحتكم منيحة وكلكم منيحة. هلا السعود مستمر Ethereum Classic ماني من محبذينه صراحةً Ethereum Classic، ما بقى في مطورين عم يشتغلوا عليه، ما بقى في صراحةً ماني من محبذينه. AVAX AVAX مشروع جيد، في تحسُّن عليه. مشروع منيح صراحةً AVAX بشكل عام، أنا من مُحبّذينه لAVAX. good بكير. هل تم الإفراج؟ إيه، هلّأ كنت قبل ما أفتح بلّش طلّعت على الtoken unlocks عم تسألني عن optimism تكنولوجيا المستقبل. شكلهم غيّروا شوي بالاستراتيجية ولكن بقى قسّموها. في هلّأ في بعد 28 يوم $33,000,000 بقيمة $33,000,000 إفراج بقيمته للoptimism. الإفراج الأكبر رح يكون هو لAptos. أبتوس في $172,000,000 بعد 10 أيام، لذلك كونوا حذرين كتير من أبتوس بدكم تدخلوا فيها هلأ، انطروا لحتى نشوف ارتداد تنخفض أكتر بكتير قبل ما تدخلوا عليها. 172,000,000 هاي كمية كتير كبيرة رح يتم الإفراج عنها. Harmony One صراحةً أنا فقدت الثقة فيها صراحةً، ماني من محبذينها مع إنه معقول تصلح. Arweave إيه أكيد رح تطلع. Arweave تذكّرني Arweave من أفضل ال الشبكات تبع الstorage، يعني من أفضل مشاريع الstorage. Solana كلّها مثلًا بينعمل لها كل شي على Solana storage على Arweave. أنا برأيي عندها كتير أمور جيدة. أهلا ياسر. إيه، واتهمتهم بالنصب مش بس إنه بهيك أمور. أنا باقول لك شو راح يحكي شعب إذا إذا شو راح يحكي جيروم باول إذا بيضل بايدن يصرف رح ننزل نشحده أنا أولكم. والله 100% هالصرف اللي عم يعمله بايدن مش مقبول. ما بيفكّر بشي. هالإدارة كتير بتصرف. engine عملة جيدة وinjective اتنيناتن مناح. كوساما بفضّل polkadot على كوساما صراحةً. هي الcanary هي الكوساما هي بيعملوا فيها تجارب لمشاريع الpolkadot عادةً يعني تقريبًا. بفضّل polkadot أنا. الإفراج عن العملة شو بيأثّر؟ الإفراج عن العملة بيعطوا العملة بيكون مُغلقة لفترة معيّنة، في عالم مستثمرة فيها من الأساس، يعني من فترة طويلة بتكون مستثمرة فيها. وقت يتم الإفراج عنّا قسم كبير من هالعالم بده ياخُد أرباح، بده يبيع، بحاجة لمال. إذا كان مستثمر من المستثمرين الأوائل وقت كان سعر العملة كتير منخفض، بيبيع. أغلب العالم بتبيع لتحجز أرباح، وهذا اللي بيصير بيتأثّر السعر وبيأدي لهبوط وقت يتم البيع بشكل كتير كبير. لذلك دايمًا وقت يكون في إفراجات كبيرة باقول لكم تنتبهوا، لأنه حتى لو نصهم باعوا أو ربعهم باعوا هالشي بيأثّر على السعر. يعني مثل هلّأ عندنا 170,000,000 بقيمة $170,000,000 من Aptos رح يتم الإفراج عنّا. بيقولوا له cliff unlock هيدا، يعني كمية كبيرة رح تأدّي يمكن لضغط بيعي. أوكي. بمؤتمر جيروم باول بعد في 8 دقايق. ما حد علمي في شي على ميتا ماسك. هلأ طالما أنت مختار الشبكة الصح أو عندك إيثيريوم، إذا عم تتأخّر أو ما عم تقدر تنمّز يمكن أيام ما بيكون عندك إيثيريوم، ما بعرف لإنه بدّك الgas fees. الله يكون بعاونكم. تكنولوجيا المستقبل عن جد، الله يكون بعاونكم بكل شي عم بيصير بفلسطين. إيه، في أيام بيغيّروا استراتيجية قبل الإفراج، كذا شبكة عم تعمل نفس الشي، ولكن بدنا ننتبه. عفوًا ب ب بدي أسألك عملات حاططهم على Binance blockchain بيتأثّر إذا Binance بتسكّر؟ وين حاططهم أنت؟ حسب وين حاططهم؟ حاططهم على Binance Smart Chain يعني تاركهم على الon chain يعني pancake swap يعني وين حاططهم تحديدًا؟ بدي أعرف. Polygon مشروع جيد، هلّأ حيغيّروا له اسمه لpoly في آخر تطوير لZK رح يكون عم يلاقي traction كتير كبير. Uniswap سبب ارتفاعها عم بيزيد من أكتر المنصات اللامركزية يلّي عم تعمل اللي عم يتم استخدامها حاليًا، أكتر وحدة بمسافات كبيرة. خلّوني بس جهّز للمؤتمر تبع جيروم باول حطّه. وأنا باكون عم ترجم على المباشر قد ما فيي با 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 بوم. فيت اوف جالا اثنيناتهم جيدين. جالا ألعاب في تشين هي more supply chain وهلّأ عم يعملوا شبكات. اثنيناتهم جيدين. جالا مشكلتي معها إنه بخاف من المحكمة اللي عم بتصير بين المؤسسين تبعها تمد ويستخدم كل سيولة الشركة صراحةً، هيدا اللي بخوّفني منها. لينك من أهم العملات، لينك منا رايحة محل بالbull market رح تعمل نتايج كتير جيدة. ما بقى من أكتر العملات استخدامًا بمجال الكريبتو بشكل عام هي chainlink من أكتر المشاريع. آآ بو 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 بوم. لأ مش سامع بماتيس داو حبيبي. شبكة دوت بدنا ننتظر نشوف التطويرات التطويرات اللي حتصير دكتور ياسر، يعني كيف بدي تطبيقات، بدي أشوف تطبيقات عم يتم استخدامها بشكل حقيقي على البولكا دوت. في تطور دائم عليها ولكن هذا كثير مهم. شو بتشوف كيف بتشوف عملة الضفدع؟ أنا بابعد عن كل شي meme coins وكل العالم بيعرفوني. هلأ مرة تانية باقول لكم اليوم هلأ توقّعوا تلاعب، دايمًا رح أقول لكم إياها بفترة الFOMC توقّعوا تلاعب صعود وهبوط ليحرقوا العالم ليعملوا liquidation. أوكي، خلّيني نوطّي. أنا دايمًا باطلّع على الlonger time frame يعني الأوقات الطويلة نهار، جمعة وغير. ولكن هيك باشكرك وائل على الدعم. باشكرك خيي على السوبر ستيكر. خلّينا نوطّي هلأ نشوف على شو عم بيصير على الchart الواطي. هيك هون الحرق اللي صار قلت لكم عنه امبارح على القد، قلت لكم 35 و100 تقريبا بده يصير، وهذا اللي صار. بوم. اللي حضرني امبارح على المباشر حكيت لكم، قلت لهم بدها توصل لهونيك وترتد، لانه في حرق كبير رح يكون للعالم. هن وصلوها قصد. بشكرك خيي وائل، مساء الخير. خلينا نشوف وين الوقت. حتركها فوق هون. مساء النور. تستاهل. بشكرك خيي، والله بحاول قد ما في ساعد المجتمع، وبقدر وقت عالم تدعمني مثل أفضالك. شو رأيك بعملة أوشن؟ إذا ماني غلطان هي بالذكاء الاصطناعي عم يعملوا شغل، والذكاء الاصطناعي رح يكون له دور بالماركت اللي جاي. ما بعرف قد ايه رح توصل سولانا، ولكن هلا في بامب كتير قوي. بتوقع البامب يوقف قريبا صراحة، لأنه هلا بعده بالمؤتمر، قلت لكم في مؤتمر سولانا بريك بوينت بيقولوا له. البريك بوينت بيعملوا فيه إعلان عن تطويرات كتير، وهذا اللي عم يعمل الفومو. أنا بفضل مقام صراحة، ما بحب أعطي نصائح استثمارية شو العالم تعمل. أخي كوبرا، عن جد يعني ما قرارك أنت خده. أوكي بدي بلش المؤتمر. خلينا نشوفه هون. بدي أحطه هو. هلا رح خليني ركز شوي على المؤتمر لأقدر ترجم لكم شو عم بيصير. وصل وجه البوم. يلا بدي أقول لكم إيش بدي أعمل. صار بايدن ما بقدر أعمل لكم شيء.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and
كل
stable
المؤتمر
prices for the
نحن
American
مركزين
people.
على هدفنا تخفيض
We understand
الفايدة
the hardship that high inflation is
والأسعار
causing,
تقدر
and we
نثبتها.
remain strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Price
بعده
stability
هدفنا
is the
2%.
responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Since early last year, the FOMC has significantly tightened the stance of monetary policy. We have raised our policy interest rate by 5.25 percentage points and have continued to reduce our securities holdings at a brisk pace. The stance of policy is restrictive, meaning that tight policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation, and the full effects of our tightening have yet to be felt.
بعدنا متركينه على
Today, we decided to
الفايدة
leave our
بعدها عالي
policy
من أعلى
interest rate
المستويات،
unchanged and to
وهدفنا
continue to reduce our securities holdings.
نوصل تضخم ل
Given how far we
2%.
have come,
لنا
along
فترة
with
عم
the
نخفض
uncertainties and
السكيورتي
risks we
هولدنجز
face,
قدام نحمل من
the committee
security
is
assets.
proceeding carefully. We will make decisions about the extent of additional policy firming and how long policy will remain restrictive based on the totality of the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks.
رح نقرر
I'll have
بالمستقبل
more to
حسب
say about monetary
المعطيات
policy after
على
briefly
إذا رح
reviewing
نكفي
economic
التشدد
developments.
ولا نزيد الفايدة ولا لا.
Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has been expanding at a strong pace and well above earlier expectations. In the third quarter, real GDP is estimated to have risen an outsized annual rate of 4.9%, boosted by a surge in consumer spending. After picking up somewhat over the summer, activity in the housing sector has flattened out and remains well below levels of a year ago, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. The labor market remains tight, but supply and demand conditions continue to come into better balance.
اليد العاملة بعده قوية، ولكن العرض والطلب عم يصير أكثر متوازن.
Nevertheless below that seen earlier in the year. The unemployment rate remains low at 3.8%.
نسبة البطالة بعدها
Strong job
منخفضة.
creation has been accompanied by an increase in the supply of workers. The labor force participation rate has moved up since late last year, particularly for individuals aged 25 to 54 years, and immigration has rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. Nominal wage growth has shown some signs of easing, and job vacancies have declined so far this year. Although the jobs to workers gap has narrowed, labor demand still exceeds the supply of available
حديث
workers.
جديد عم بيعيد.
Inflation remains well above our longer run goal of
بعده
2%.
تضخم أعلى بكتير من المراكز اللي بدنا
Total
إياه نحن.
PCE prices rose 3.4% over the 12 months ending in September. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 3.7%.
الأساسي التضخم الأساسي
Inflation has
ارتفع
moderated since
مؤخرا.
the middle of last year, and readings over the summer were quite favorable. But a few months of good data are only the beginning of what it will take to build confidence that inflation is moving down
بعد الأشهر
sustainably toward our goal.
من المعطيات
The
الجيدة
process of getting
هي
inflation
البداية
sustainably down
بس،
to
لأنه
2%
بدنا نشوف وين
has a
بدنا
long way to
نوصل
go.
للمكان اللي نحن بدنا إياه.
Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our
نعرف
mandate, and we are strongly
تأثير
committed to returning
التضخم
inflation to our
على
2% objective.
على الاقتصاد. بعده
As
هدفنا
I noted
نوصل ل
earlier, since
2%.
early last year, we have raised our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points, and we have decreased our securities holdings by more than $1 trillion. A restrictive stance of monetary policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. The committee decided at today's meeting to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate
قررت
at 5.25 to
الجمعية إنه
5.5%.
نترك
To continue
الفايدة
the process of
مرتفعة
significantly reducing our securities holdings.
وعم نخفض قد ايه
We are
بنحمل من
committed to
securities.
achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation sustainably down to 2%
بدنا نكفي
over
بالسياسة
time,
النقدية المتشددة
and to keeping
لنخفض التضخم
policy
للمراكز اللي
restrictive
بدنا إياه.
until we are confident that inflation is on a path to that objective.
ما رح
We
نخفض
are
غير ما
attentive to
نتأكد
recent
إنه
data
نحن على
showing the
الطريق
resilience
الصحيح
of
لنوصل
economic growth and
لهدفنا.
demand for labor. Evidence of growth persistently above potential, or that tightness in the labor market is no longer easing, could put further progress on inflation at risk and could warrant further tightening of monetary policy. Financial conditions have tightened significantly in recent months,
في
driven
تشدد
by higher,
بكل
longer
الأمور
firm bond
المالية إلى
yields, among
فترة.
other factors. Because persistent changes in financial conditions can have implications for the path of monetary policy, we monitor financial developments closely.
نحن عم نراقب كل
In
الأمور
light of the
المالية
uncertainties and risks and how
بالاقتصاد
far we have come, the committee is proceeding carefully.
نسبة لوين
We
وصلنا
continue to
وقديت
make our
قدامنا.
decisions meeting
نحن
by
هلا
meeting
عم
based on the
ندرس كل خطوة
totality of the
بخطوتها.
incoming data and their implications for the outlook and for economic activity and inflation, as well as the balance of risks.
مع يعني
Determining the extent of
حسب
additional
الأوضاع
policy firming that
الاقتصادية
may be
وبدنا
appropriate
ندرس
to
كمان
return inflation to
المخاطر
2%
اللي
over
كمان
time.
بيتعين عليها.
The committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2%
بيرجع بعيد.
goal
بعدنا
and to keeping longer-term inflation
هدفنا
expectations
نوصل
well
التضخم
anchored.
2% وبدنا نثبت الأسعار.
Reducing
هذا
inflation
هدفنا
is likely to
وما رح
require a period
نوقف
of
عنه.
below potential growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential.
يعني عم بعيد حاله صراحة. عم بعيد ما في ولا خبر جديد. دايما بنسمعهم هن ذاتهم. هلا الأهم المهم هو الأجوبة على أسئلة الصحفية لأنه رح يشدوا عليه لا ياخذوا منه معلومات.
We at the Fed will do everything we can
تم
to achieve
وقف
our
نسبة
maximum
الفايدة.
employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward
يعني
to your
حتى هو
questions.
لاحظوه منه عم يقرا عادة بيقرا الورقة حافظهم صار قد ما عم بيعيدها له فترة.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thank you, Chair Powell, for doing this. To what you referenced the rise in long-term bond yields, to what degree did that supplant action by the Fed at this meeting?
Thanks for your question. So I'll talk about bond yields, but I want to take a second and just sort of set the broader context in which we're looking at that. So if you look at the situation, let's look at the economy first. Inflation has been coming down, but it's still running well above our 2% target.
التضخم عم ينزل
The
ولكن
labor
بعده
market has
مرتفع
been
كتير.
rebalancing, but it's still very tight by many measures. GDP growth has been strong, although many forecasters are
GDP
forecasting and have been forecasting that it will slow.
الناتج الإجمالي المحلي بعده عم
As for the committee,
مرتفع
we are
وهو
committed to
الاقتصاد
achieving a
مبين قوي.
stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. And we're not confident yet that we have achieved such a stance.
كيكون دايما
So
في
that is the
تلاعب
broader
وقت
context
حديثه.
into which the strong economy and all the things I said, that's the context in which we're looking at this question of rates. So obviously we're monitoring, we're attentive to the increase in longer term yields,
بعدنا عم نراقب
which have
كل
contributed
المعطيات.
to a tightening of broader financial conditions since the summer. As mentioned, persistent changes in broader financial conditions can have implications for the path of
هلا
monetary
بسبب
policy.
التغييرات اللي عم
In this
نشوفها
case, the tighter financial conditions we're seeing from higher long-term rates,
بالاقتصاد
also
والامور
from
الماليه
other
العالميه
sources
من واحد
like
من ناحيه
the
النفط
stronger
وكل
dollar
الامور هالشيء
and
دائما
lower
بدنا
equity
ندرسه
prices
ونشوف شو عم
could
بيأثر.
matter for future rate decisions as long as two conditions are satisfied. The first is that the tighter conditions would need to be persistent, and that is something that remains to be seen. But that's critical. Things are fluctuating back and forth.
الامور عم تتغير بشكل دائم لازم نراقبها وعلى اساسها نعمل.
Changes that are material. The second thing is that the longer term rates that have moved up, they can't simply be a reflection of expected policy moves from us. That we would then, if we didn't follow through on them, then the rates would come back down. So and I would say on that, it does not appear that an expectation of higher near-term policy rates is causing the increase in longer-term rates. So in the meantime, though,
بالوقت
perhaps the
الحالي
most important thing is that these higher treasury yields are showing through to higher borrowing costs for households and businesses, and those higher costs are going to weigh on economic activity to the extent this tightening persists. And the mind's eye goes to the 8%, near 8% mortgage rate, which could have pretty significant effect on housing. So that's how I would answer your question.
Just as a quick follow-on to be clear on this, in your opening statement and just now, you seem to imply that you are not yet confident that financial conditions are
بكلمتك الافتتاحية أنت عم تقول إنه بعدك منك confident يعني منك عندك واثق من إنه من التضخم إنه رح ينزل بالمراكز هيك.
We have not made a determination, and I will say that we're not confident at this time that we've reached such a stance. We're not confident that we haven't. We're not confident that we have.
ما واثقين إنه وصلنا ولا ما واثقين إنه ما وصلنا.
The way we're going to go into these future meetings is to be, just determining the extent of any additional further policy tightening that may be appropriate.
لك الدولار الأمريكي أنتوا لك الدولار الأمريكي وين صار؟ 107 يا باطل عقله. بس الإيجابي بالموضوع آخر مرة كان الدولار الأمريكي 107 البيتكوين كانت منخفضة كثير أقل بكثير. يعني هلا البيتكوين عم يبتعد شوي عن الأسواق التقليدية وعن الدولار عم يعمل decoupling وهذا إيجابي.
At that point that we should expect that rates are at their peak, or is there a possibility of restarting rate increases next year? And are there any costs to taking a more extended pause?
هل معقول نشوف زيادات فوائد أكثر السنة المقبلة وشو التأثير إذا تركنا الفوائد مثل ما هي لفترة أطول؟
We're going into this summer meeting. We'll get, as you know, 2 more inflation readings, 2 more labor market readings, some data on economic activity, and so we'll be taking, and also the broader situation, the broader financial condition situation, and the broader world situation.
رح ناخذ المعطيات
in December. We haven't made that decision.
بعد ما أخذنا القرار ناطرين المعطيات اللي تجي لعنا.
The idea that you would be difficult to raise again after stopping for a meeting or two is just not right. I mean, the committee will always do what it thinks is appropriate at the time.
نحن بالفيدرالية رح نجتمع وناخذ كل شيء وقتها نعمل كل شيء بيفيد الاقتصاد. هذا اللي رح نعمله يعني لنجيب البرايس ستابيليتي ونثبت. هذا الهدف تبعنا.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, did the Fed staff put a recession back into the baseline forecast in the materials for today's meeting? And how much
هل
does this
الموظفين عندكم
tightening in financial
بالفيدرالي
conditions
ستاف
substitute
حطوا
for rate
ريسيشن
hikes
انه
if
ركود
the
اقتصادي؟
tightening is persistent? You had said it was worth maybe a quarter point when we had the bank failures in the spring. What is it here on something that's presumably more straightforward and more familiar to simulate?
So I guess I don't want to answer your question about the recession, but the answer is no. I think I have to answer it since we did publicly say in the minutes. You'll know anyway in the minutes. The staff did not put a recession back in. I mean, it would be hard to see how you would do that if you look at the activity we've seen recently,
هلا
which is
حاطين
not really
ركود اقتصادي ما
indicative
فينا
of a
خاص ما
recession
فينا
near
نقول
term.
انه نحن بركود
In terms
اقتصادي
of
خاصة اذا بتشوف
how to think
الاكتيفيتيز
about
تبع الاقتصاد
translation
يعني من ناحية
into
الجي دي بي
rate
من
hikes,
ناحية
I think
هالامور كلها عم
it's
بتزيد
just too
واليد
early to be
العامة
doing that.
والبطالة.
And the main reason is we just don't know how persistent this will be. You can see how volatile it is. Different kinds of news will affect the level of rates. I think any kind of an estimate that was, precise would hang out there and have a great chance of looking wrong very quickly. So I think what we can say is that financial conditions have clearly tightened, and you can see that in the rates that consumers and
في
households and
تشدد
businesses are paying
نقدي وبلشنا
now.
نشوف هالامر
And over time,
بمبيعات
that will have an
البيوت
effect. We
بكل
just don't know how
هالامور.
persistent it's going to be, and it's tough to try to translate that in a way that I'd be comfortable communicating into how many rate hikes that is.
بس ما في لكم يعني قد ايه رح ياثر على نسبة رفع
What makes you
الفائدة.
confident that tighter financial conditions will slow above trend growth when 500 basis points of rate hikes, QT, and a minor banking crisis have not thus far?
Well, that's the way our policy works is, and sometimes it works with lags, of course, which can be long and variable, but ultimately
قال له هيدي الطريقة اللي بتشتغل فيها سياساتنا أيام
you do
السياسات
see
نتائجها
those
بتتأخر
effects, and you see
لنشوفها.
those effects in the economy now. You see what's happening in the housing market. You're seeing that now. You'll see, if you look at surveys of people, it's not a good time, they think, to buy durable goods of various kinds because rates are so high now. I mentioned again, we're getting reports from housing that the effects of this could be quite significant. But you're right. This has been a resilient economy, and it's, I think, been surprising in its resilience. And there are a number of possible reasons why that may be. Our job is to achieve maximum employment and price stability, and so we take the economy as it comes. It has been resilient, so we take it as it is.
الاقتصاد بعده قوي كثير وعم ريزيلينت يعني عم بيقاوم كل الامور وعم بيلاقي حلول
In terms of the
لها.
thresholds that you've laid out of what could warrant further tightening, the additional evidence of persistently above trend growth or some kind of reversal in the recent easing of labor market tightness, that seems to suggest something more powerful than just one more quarter point rate hike would be necessary. And I'm just curious if that's how the committee sees it.
عم يسألوا إذا
So
هل
we've
معقول
identified those factors. Those are
نشوف
not meant to be
ريت
the
هايك
only
تاني يعني
factors
زيادة
or a
فوائد مرة
specific
تانية.
test that we're going to be applying with some metrics behind it. Really, we're going to be looking at the broader picture. And
نحن عم
what's
نطلع على
happening with our progress
البرودر
toward
بيكتشر
the
يعني
2%
على
inflation
الصورة
goal. Is the
الكاملة
labor market
الأكبر.
continuing to broadly cool off and achieve a better balance? We'll be looking at that. Growth, we look at growth insofar as it has implications for our two mandate goals. We look at that. And we look at broader financial conditions. So we'll be looking at all of those things as we reach a judgment,
أخي علي.
whether we need to further tighten policy. And if we do reach that judgment, then we will further tighten policy.
إذا وصلنا لمرحلة إنه بنشوف بعدنا رح نضيق أكثر رح يزيد الفوائد أكثر حسب المعطيات تبعنا وحسب شو بنشوف. مرة ثانية عم بعيد حديثه عم يجاوبه بطريقة ثانية نفس الجواب.
Or have to see more than what the September SEP indicated?
So the fact is the committee is not thinking about rate cuts right now at all. We're not talking about rate cuts. We're still very focused on the first question, which is have we achieved a stance of monetary policy
نحن ما عم نفكر حتى بالريت كاتس بتخفيض الفوائد. بعده هدفنا نوصل ل 2%. هذا الهدف الرئيسي.
As you know, will be for how long will we remain restrictive? Will policy remain restrictive? And what we said there is that we'll keep policy restrictive until we're confident that inflation is on a sustainable path down to 2%. That'll be the next question. But honestly, right now, we're really tightly focused on the first question. the question of rates cuts just doesn't come up because I think
الريت
for-
كاتس
so
تخفيض
important to get to that
الفوائد
first
منه
question,
سؤال ما عم نطلع
you
فيه
know,
ابدا
as
حاليا.
close to right as you can.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chairman, I guess I had assumed that there was a tightening bias in the committee. You say in the statement you're looking to assess the appropriate stance of monetary policy, the extent to which you may need to hike additionally. You didn't say earlier that you were sufficiently restrictive. There were forecasts for 2 rate hikes among most members of the committee. But then you just said that, you know, we haven't made a determination. Would you say the bias right now is neutral, that there is no disposition to hike again, and that the committee
هل
urges
معقول
move
هل
off of
بتقول
this
معقول
forecast
تقول
for 2
انه
hikes?
هلا
Additional
I
hike
think
is
you're
there.
talking about one.
المجتمع
Yeah,
نيوترال
I
يعني
wouldn't say that at all. I
اعضاء
would say
فيدرالي
the
نيوترال
language,
يعني
you
ما
know,
لا مع
looking at it here,
ولا ضد
in determining the extent of additional
تبع زيادة
policy
الفوائد
firming
يعني
that
عم
may
يحكي
be
هون.
appropriate to return inflation 2% over time. That's the question we're asking.
So is
So-
it right to think of that as a hiking bias is still in the committee here?
We haven't used that term, but it's fair to say that's the question we're asking: is should we hike more? It's not, you know, and that is the question. And you're right that in September we wrote down 1 additional rate hike, but you know, we'll write down another.
السؤال
forecast in
هل
December.
بنزيد اكثر ولا لا؟ ما في قرارات مرتين ما يعني نيوترال هلا
Thank
حاليا
you, Chris
بانتظار
Rugaber at Associated
المعطيات.
Press. Well, since the last meeting, the auto workers strike has finished. Oil prices have leveled off. And yet, on the other hand, you have the outbreak of war between Israel and Hamas. How do you see all those factors taken together affecting the economy going forward? How are you thinking about those?
So there are significant issues out there, as you point out. Global
في أمور
geopolitical
عالمية
tensions
كتير
are certainly
مهمة.
elevated, and that goes for the war in Ukraine. It goes for the war between
بالنسبة
Israel and
للحرب
Hamas.
بأوكرانيا الحرب
We're monitoring
بفلسطين.
that. Our job is to monitor those things for their economic
نحن هدفنا نراقب
implications.
هالأمور وشو تأثيرها على الاقتصاد.
So the UAW strike, as you point out, is appears to be coming to an end. Oil prices have flattened out; they haven't gone down, but I guess they've gone down a little bit from their earlier peak. Another one is the possibility of government
لا
shutdown.
ثبتوا
We don't know
الفائدة.
about that one. So there's plenty of risk out there.
في مخاطر
But I
كتير
would go
كبيرة.
back to the bigger picture from our standpoint is we've got a very strong economy, strong labor market.
ولكن
making
بالنسبة
progress on
إلى
the labor
الصورة
market, making progress on
الكبرى
inflation,
عنا اقتصاد
and,
قوي.
we're very focused on
هدفنا بعده
getting confident that we have
نزيد
achieved
نرد
stance of
الثقة
monetary
على
policy is
الاقتصاد على
sufficiently restrictive. That's really our focus.
على
Okay, just one quick
المجال.
thing. You last month had gone to York, Pennsylvania, where you talked to a lot of, last month, where you talked to a lot of small business owners. Just curious, what sentiments did you hear from them, or what
رحت
did you
على
pick
منطقة
up
أنت
on?
الشهر الماضي
Was there
وحكيت
anything that
مع
surprised you the most in terms of what they
أصحاب
told you?
أعمال كيف حسيت شو عم
I
يصير؟
wouldn't say I was terribly surprised. I was very impressed by York as a town with a real strategy, and I would say it's very impressive what the people there have put together in the face of some difficult longer run trends about offshoring of manufacturing and that kind of thing. They've done a great job as a city, I think. What you hear and is consistent there, which is people are really suffering under high inflation. You were there. We talked to
العالم
some
عم
people
تنزعج
who,
بسبب التضخم
were feeling that
المرتفع.
in their businesses, and other people who are feeling it in their home lives as well. It's painful for people, particularly people who don't have a lot of extra financial resources, who are spending most of their income on the essentials of life. So we know that wasn't new, but that did come through very
العالم
clearly.
بلش عم بتحس بارتفاع
in the
الأسعار
conversation we had in York. And,
وتأثيره.
I walked away from that even, just thinking that we really, the best thing we can do for the U.S. is to restore price stability.
أفضل شيء بدنا نعمله هو
fully
لا
restore price
أمريكا هو
stability and
إنه
not fail in that
نرد
task, and
ثبات
do it as
الأسعار.
quickly as possible, but also with the least damage we can.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel
أهلا
Siegel from the
ماهر.
Washington Post. Thanks for taking our
بشكرك على الدعم
questions.
الدائم.
You've spoken
the
before
subscribers.
about the pain that would likely be coming for the economy in order to get inflation down. But since the economy has not responded to rate hikes in ways that would normally be expected, have you changed your views on that at all, on how necessary or inevitable that kind of pain would be, say, for the labor market or overall growth?
Well, I think everyone has been very gratified to see that we've been able to achieve, pretty significant progress on inflation without seeing the kind of increase in unemployment that has been very typical of rate hiking cycles like this one. So that's a historically unusual and very welcome result. And the same is true of growth. We've been saying that we need to see below potential growth, and growth has been strong, but yet we're still seeing this. I still believe, and my colleagues, for the most part, I think still believe that it is likely to be true. It is still likely to be true, not a certainty, but likely that we will need to see some slower growth and some softening in labor market conditions to get to fully restore price stability. So, but it's only a good thing that we haven't seen, and I think we know why. Since we lifted off, we have understood that there are really two processes at work here. One of which is the unwinding of the distortions to both supply and demand from the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, and the other is restrictive monetary policy, which is moderating demand and giving the supply side time to recover, time and space to recover. So you see those two forces now working together to bring down inflation. But it's that first one can bring down inflation without the need for higher unemployment or slower growth. It's supply side improvements like
نفس الحديث، ما في شيء جديد، عم بعيد نفس الخبر صراحة. عم يحكي بنا كنا متوقعين انخفاض بالنمو، بعد النمو عم يكبر، هدفنا 2%. يعني تلاقيه نفس الحديث عم بزهق أعيد الترجمة صراحة.
That is really helping the economy, and it's part of why GDP is so high, is because
ما رح يقدر يعمل شيء. الزلمة ضايع، صرف بطريقة غير مقبولة من قبل الإدارة بسبب الحروب، بسبب كل الامور، ارتفاع اسعار النفط، يعني امور بخارج ارادته. هو بعده غير عفوا ما عنده غير انه يزيد الفائده، وزياده الفائده وصل لمرحله خطره كثير.
Against that backdrop, if you've gotten
يعني
any
اذا بده
clarity
يكفي زيادات، في
if you
بنوك
have an
عم
economy that's
بتواجه
been so
مشاكل
resilient
كثير
to
كبيره
high
صارت
rate increases,
بامريكا.
does that suggest to you that there isn't necessarily this huge wave of tightening that's still coming through the pipeline and that it may have already come into effect?
I continue
عم
to
بيقول
think
هل معقول ما بقى نشوف tightening تشدد؟
At this meeting 1 year ago, this was the fourth of our 75 basis points hikes. So that's a full year since then. I think we are seeing the effects of all the hiking we did last year, and this year we're seeing it.
الزيادات اللي عملناها السنة الماضية.
Exactly what that might be. But you can, for example, an example of where you wouldn't have felt this yet is debt that had been termed out, but it's going to come due and have to get rolled over next year or the year after. So, and there are little things like that where the effects are just taking time to get into the economy. So, I think we have to make monetary policy under great uncertainty about how long the lags are. I think trying to get a clear answer and say, I'm just going to assume this, is really not a good way to do it. And this is one of the reasons why we have slowed the process down this year, was to give monetary policy time to get into the economy. And it takes time, we know that, and you can't rush it. So slowing down is giving us, I think, a better sense of how much more we need to do if we need to do more.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm trying to connect the dots here. One quick clarification I want to ask about Rachel's question is, you said you need slower growth. You had always said before a period of lower than trend growth. Has that changed? And two, it sounds to me like you're basically saying here that the dot plots out the window, that every meeting is live with the possibility of a rate increase for right now. It doesn't matter about the turn of the year, and that there's not an objective way to determine whether or not you've got enough tightening in the system. It's just going to be a subjective judgment meeting by meeting.
Well, so let's talk about the dot plot first. So the dot plot is a picture in time of what the people in the committee thinks is likely to be an appropriate monetary policy in light of their own personal economic forecast. In principle, when things change, that's not like a plan that anybody's agreed to or that we will do. That's a forecast.
هذا عم
that
يحكي
could
عن
change, for example.
مثل
Many things
مخطط
could
او
change that
شيء
would
من
cause
يعني
people
اذا
to say,
عاملين خطه
I wouldn't
معينه
write down that
بس
you know,
هالشيء مش
6
يعني
months later.
100%
Think of
رح
the number
يصير
of
بدنا
things that could
نشوف شو
change your
اذا
mind
في
on that. So
تغيرات
I
بالاقتصاد
think
تغيرات
the
سياسيه
efficacy
كل
of the
هالامور
dot
بتاثر على
plot probably
الموضوع.
decays over the 3-month period
ما
between
قرر
that
ما في
meeting and
رفع
the next
فايده
meeting.
بعد
But
ما
nonetheless, it's out
كان
there.
عم
We
بيقول
don't.
عم يدرس
We do
الموضوع ومعقول
personally
يزيدوا معقول ما
update
يزيدوا.
our
انا برايي
forecast,
ما
but we
رح
don't formally
يزيدوا
update the dot plot. So
حاليا، ما رح يقدر
you
بقى
know,
يزيد
I think we try to
صراحه.
be as transparent as we can about the way we're thinking about these things. We're laying out there our thinking, and you know, as we approach the meeting, we'll all be, my colleagues and I will be talking
هل
about
رح
how we're
يرتفع
processing
البيتكوين
that
حاليا؟
data.
حاليا انا
In
بعتقد
terms
رح
of
في
so
تذبذبات
we're
على
not really
عقب
changing the way
المؤتمر،
in terms of
مؤتمر جيروم باول بدنا
growth.
نرجع للاماكن
What
ذاتها
I said was below
تقريبا.
potential.
صراحه
So
في
what you
ايجابيه
have
بالسوق للبيتكوين،
here
ولكن هذا
recently is
في
growth that
مخاوف
is
من الحروب كمان. هذا هي الامور
temporarily
اللي عم
potential
تترك
growth
البيتكوين ثابت
is
حاليا.
elevated for a
ولكن
year or two
انا
right
برايي
now
تذبذب
over
ليحرقوا
its
اللونجز
trend
والشورتس
level.
مثل
So the right
العاده.
way to think about it is
العالم
what's
الفايتين
potential
ليفرج
growth this
تريدينج
year.
مثل ما قلت لكم هون.
People think trend growth over a long period of time is a little bit less than 2%, or I would say just around 2%. But what we've had is with the improvement in the size of the labor force, as I mentioned, through both participation and immigration, and with the better functioning in the labor market, and with the unwinding of the supply
بتمنى
chain
عليكم
and
تشتركوا
shortages
بالقناه
and those
وتعملوا
kinds of
لايك
things, you're
سبسكرايب.
seeing actually elevated potential growth. There's catch-up growth that can happen in potential. And that means that if you could be growing at 2% this year and still be growing below the increase in the potential output of the economy. I hope that's clear. That's really what's going on. That's why I would say it as below potential.
But if you could clarify what I asked about meeting by meeting, are we essentially now supposed to assume that it's a meeting by meeting, live meeting with a chance of a rate increase that will be decided on subjective criteria rather than objective at each meeting?
I mean, I don't know that I want to just accept anybody's characterization of it. I'll tell you how we're doing this. So we're going meeting by meeting.
دائما بدنا
We're asking
اجتماع
ourselves whether
بالاجتماع
we've achieved a
تنتظروا.
stance of
قال
policy
له
that is
انا عم
sufficiently
روح
restrictive
مجبور انطر
to bring
كل
inflation
اجتماع
down 2% over time.
ونقرر مع بعضنا.
That's
بعده
the question
هدفنا
we're asking.
نوصل
We're looking at the
ل 2%،
full
مراقبة
range
على
of economic
2%.
data, including financial conditions and all of those things that we look at. And then we've come very far with this rate hiking cycle, very far.
قدمنا
And
بشكل كتير
you
كبير
saw the spread at the September
بزيادات
meeting.
الفوائد.
It's a relatively small spread of people think 1 or 2 additional hikes. So you're close to the end of the cycle.
في
That
بعض
was
العالم عم
inflation
بيقولوا
as of
لازمنا
a
وحدة
belief
أو
as
اثنين
of
زيادة
September.
فوائد،
It's not a promise or a plan of the future.
ولكن
So
منا
we're going into
خطة
these
هيدي. هاي
meetings one
نفترض
by one.
نحن.
We're looking at the data. As I mentioned, we're also, we're being careful. We're proceeding carefully because we can proceed carefully at this time. Monetary policy is restrictive. We see its effects,
عم نراقب
particularly in
ونتصرف
interest-sensitive spending and other
بشكل
channels. So that's how I
نحن بمنطقة حساسة بدنا ناخذ القرارات المناسبة يعني.
Thanks. Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. In light of the run-up in long-term yields that we've seen the last several weeks, have you given any consideration to the pace of your asset runoff program? And if there were a judgment that the higher term premium was endangering the dual mandate goals, would that be reason to think about slowing or suspending QT, or should we think of that as more of a technical question around reserves?
So committee is not considering changing the pace of balance sheet runoff. It's not something we're talking about or considering. And I know there are many candidate explanations for why rates have been going up. And QT is certainly on that list. It may be playing a relatively small effect, although I would say at $3.3 trillion in reserves, it's not, I think it's hard to make a case that reserves are even close to scarce at this point. So that's not something that we're looking at right now.
شوف بس ردة فعل العملات، أحد الأشخاص قال ردة فعل العملات البديلة، العملات الثانية كانت جيدة.
Hi, Victoria Guida with
خلينا
Politico.
نشوف شو
I
عم
wanted to
بيصير
ask about the
بالسوق.
Basel III endgame capital proposal. You've gotten a lot of pushback from people on different aspects of the proposal, and you yourself expressed some reservations. And I'm just curious, could you accept finalizing that proposal without significant changes?
So that proposal is out for comment, and we expect a lot of comment. We won't get those comments until the end of, well into next year. We've extended the deadline, and we'll take them seriously. We'll read them. I'll say what I do expect is that we will we're a consensus-driven organization. We'll come to a package that has broad support on the board.
So does broad support mean more support? than
صلانة
the
بعد
proposal had?
الطائرة
It means broad
بشكل
support.
عام يعني.
Janelle Marte with Bloomberg. So, in addition to persistence, when you look at long-term treasury yields, what else are you watching to evaluate how those tighter financial conditions are hitting the economy and if it will lessen the need for further tightening? Also, do you think that those higher yields could affect banking stress?
So what do we look at? We look at a very wide
Mr.
range of
Nasser.
financial conditions. And in fact, as you'll know, different organizations publish different financial conditions indexes, which can have 7 or 8 variables, or they can have 100 variables. So there's a very rich environment, and we tend to look at a few of them. I'm not going to give you the names, but they're a few of the common ones that people look at. And so they're looking at things like the level of the dollar, the level of equity prices, the level of rates, the credit spreads. Sometimes they're pulling in credit availability and things like that. So it isn't any one thing. We would never look at, for example, long-term treasury rates in isolation, nor will we ignore them. But we would look at them as part of a broader picture. And they do play a role, of course, in many of the major standard financial condition indexes. Your second question was banking stress. So it's something we're watching. As you know, we did have there were issues with
عم
interest
يحكوا
rate
عن
risk,
الضغوطات على البنوك.
and also,
قالوا هذا شيء عم نراقبه
funding
نحن.
uninsured deposits in the March, the things we went through in March and thereafter. And so we've
الأمور
been
اللي
working a
شفناها
lot with
بشهر
financial
3 أكيد
institutions
أثرت
to
علينا عم
make sure that
نراقبها
they
وأكيد
have
بتاخد دور
good funding
بقراراتنا،
plans
ولكن
and
هدفنا
good
الأساسي بعد التضخم
and that they have
وننزل
a plan
2%.
for how to deal with
يعني
the kind of
الريكورد ذاته،
portfolio
الكلمات ذاتها.
unrealized losses that they have. We do think the banking system is quite resilient. We had a
بس
handful of bank
بمجال
failures, but
البنوك
so that's what they're
بعده
doing.
قوي.
And
البانكينج سيستم
we don't have any
النظام
reason to
المصرفي
think that
بعده قوي،
that
هيك
these
عم بيقول
rate
هو
hikes
صراحة ما
are
بعرف
materially
قد
changing
ايه
that
قوي،
picture,
بعد
which
ما
is one
بنشوف
of a strong
تصدعات
banking
كثير
system and
كبيرة.
one where there's a strong focus by banks and by supervisors on liquidity, on funding, and those sorts of things.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Scott Horsley from NPR. Last week, you and your colleagues put forward a proposal to lower the cap on debit card swipe fees for comment. Could you just talk a little about
عملت اقتراح
considerations
لتخفيض
there, what it would mean
كلفة
for
المعاملات
merchants, for banks, for consumers, and also
على
just what y'all are
الكروتة.
seeing in terms of the use of both debit and credit cards in the payment system?
So you're right. We put a proposal out for comment is what we did. And, this is a job that Congress assigned us, as you of course know, in Dodd-Frank, and all we can really do is faithfully implement the statute. That's all we're trying to do. What else can we really do? It's a 90-day comment period. We typically don't comment on these things once they're out for comment. And we do hope that stakeholders
نحن
know
ما
that they will
عليها
use
إلا
this
بعد ما
opportunity
يتم
to
الموافقة
express their
عليها.
views. They haven't been shy about that. So that's critical, and that's what I can say about that now.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So over the last 3 months, the year-over-year PCE inflation was at 3.4%, core well over 3%. You've said in the past 2% remains the Federal Reserve target, but with no rate increase today, how long would you be okay then with a 3% or 3% plus overall inflation?
The progress is probably going to come in lumps and be bumpy, but we're making progress. I think the core PCE came down by almost 60 basis points in the third quarter. So if you the best thing I could point you to would be the September SEP, where the expectation was that inflation by the end of next year on a 12-month trailing basis would be well into the twos, and the year after that further into the twos. So that's if you look historically, that's sort of consistent with the way inflation comes down. It does take some time, and as you get as you get further and further from those highs, it may actually take longer time. But the good news is we're making progress, and
الخبر الإيجابي إنه عم نشوف
we're
تقدم.
on a path to make more progress, and it's essential that we do.
على الطريق
In the
المضبوط
past
يعني.
that doing too little on interest rates could take years to fix, but the cost of doing too much could be easily fixed. How robust was the debate about this pause
إذا بنعمل قليل
on the
كثير
doing too little side?
فينا
That's
ننهي بس
always
ولكن
the
إذا
question we're
شددنا
asking
على فترة
ourselves,
كبيرة
and we know that if
هالشيء رح
we
يعمل
fail to restore
آثار
price
كبيرة.
stability, the risk is that expectations of higher inflation get entrenched in the economy.
صراحة ما بشوفها
and we
كريم
know
لا
that that's
إيجابية
really
ولا
bad for
سلبية،
people.
بشوفها
Inflation will be both more
الكلام
both higher
ذاته
and more
يعني أنا
volatile.
قلت لكم رح نشوف
That's
صعود
a
وهبوط
prescription for
ويرجع
misery.
تذبذب عرضي،
And,
وهذا
and
اللي
so
هذا اللي عم
we're really
نشوفه
committed
لحظة
to not letting
هبوط
that happen.
وعرضي. ما
You know, for
الكلام
the
ما
first
لا
year or
عم
so
بيأخر
of
ولا
that
عم
tightening cycle, the risk
بيقدم
was all
بقى
on the
صراحة
side of not doing enough.
بهالمرحلة
We're,
إن
you know, we've come
كلامه
far
إنه
enough
مثل
that
عم بيعيد
the
ما عم
risks,
بيزيد
you know,
وما
have gotten more two-sided. You can't
حاليا
identify
لو
that
زاد
with
أو
a lot
خفض
of
فارق بقول
precision,
لك
but it does
هالشيء
feel like
بيأثر
the
بشكل كثير
risks
كبير.
are
ما
more
عم
two-sided
بيأثر
now.
بقى وخاصة بظل الصرف اللي عم
And
نشوفه يعني.
but we're
هلا
committed to getting inflation
بالعالم
back down to our target over time,
أول
and we
شيء في
will.
خوف من الحروب إنه تمتد وتكبر، هيدا خوف. بس من ناحية إيجابية عندك البلاك روك، فانايك،
Simon Rabinovich with The
جراي
Economist.
سكيلز، البيتكوين
Quick
سبوت
follow-up to
اي
the
تي
question
اف
about
جاي
banking
والبيتكوين
expresses.
هافينج، هاي
You
الأمور
talked
كثير
about how the banking
إيجابية.
system is
عم
resilient.
بيعدلوا بعضهم
Of
هلا
course, part of the
بمرحلة
resilience of the past
انتظار،
year
ولكن
stems from
السوق
the Bank Term Funding
البيتكوين
Program
في
that you
كثير
launched in
إيجابية عليها.
March. Given that bond prices have not recovered, that unrealized losses are probably mounting, how likely is it that you might have to extend that program in March next year?
Good question. We haven't really been thinking about that yet. We, you know, it's November 1, and that's a decision we'll be making in the first quarter of next year.
Okay. Sorry, quick separate question about inflation expectations. The Michigan Sentiment Survey showed a big jump in 1 year ahead inflation expectations last month from 3.2 to 4.2. Last year, you said that particular survey was a really decisive factor in one of your rate hike decisions. If it stays elevated next time around, how big of an input will that be into your December thinking?
Yeah, we look at a range of things. I think the you know the UM estimate that got revised away, and I said it was preliminary in that, but that didn't get picked up. So we look at many things, and so really look across the broad array of surveys and also market-based estimates, and you know, and we do that really carefully at every meeting and between meetings. And you know, it's just clear that inflation expectations are in a good place. The public does believe that inflation will get back down to 2% over time, and it will. They're right. So, and there's no real crack in that armor. You can always find one reading that is a little bit out of whack, but honestly, the bulk of them are just very clear that the public believes that inflation will come down, and that's of course we believe that's critical.
بشكل عام أغلب الناس بتعتقد إنه التضخم رح ينزل وفي ثقة بهالموضوع
Hi, Chair
ونحن
Powell. My name
بنوافق
is Stella
هذا.
with Barron's. Thanks for taking our questions. I wanted to see if you could talk about the neutral rate. You mentioned today that you're still debating whether rates are sufficiently restrictive, and you've recently said that evidence is suggesting policy is not too tight right now. So I was curious if you could elaborate on that at all and whether that means the neutral rate, in your view, has risen.
Yeah. So first thing to say is that it's very important. It's a very important variable in the way we think about monetary policy, but you can't identify it with any precision in real time. And we know that. So you have to just take that. You have to take your estimate of it with a grain of salt. What we know now is, you know, within a range of estimates of the neutral rate, policy is restrictive. And it's therefore putting downward pressure on economic activity, hiring, and inflation. So we do talk about this. There's not any debate or attempt to sort of agree as a group on whether R-star has moved or not. Some people think it has. Some people haven't said that don't think it has. Ultimately, it's unknowable. And so really, again, what we're focused on is, looking at the data and giving ourselves a little more time now to look carefully at the data by being careful in our moves. Does it feel like monetary policy is restrictive enough to bring inflation down to 2% over time? That's the question we're asking ourselves.
هلا عم بيسألوا حالهم هل التشدد اللي نحن عاملينه والسياسات اللي نحن كافي لتهبط التضخم ل 2% محل ما نحن ناطرين توصل التضخم ل 2%؟ ما بنعرف. هذا السؤال اللي عم نراقبه.
We have to have those models and look at them and think about them, but ultimately we've got to look at the effects of that policy is having, accounting for the lags, which makes it difficult.
If I could follow up on a wages point earlier, you talked about the inflation outlook, but I'm curious if you have any concerns whether wage inflation at its current level could risk pushing up overall inflation or reacceleration.
So if you look at the broad range of wages, they have wage increases have really come down significantly over the course of the last 18 months to a level where they're substantially closer to that level that would be consistent with 2% inflation over time, making standard assumptions about productivity over time. So it's much closer than it was. And that's true of the ECI, which is the one that we got this week. It's true of average hourly earnings and compensation per hour too. So, and all of them are kind of saying that, which is great. And you have to look at a group of them because any one of them can be idiosyncratic in any given reading. So that's what you see. And so what you saw with the ECI reading was, if you look back comes out 4 times a year. If you look back a couple of quarters, you'll see it was much higher, and then it came down substantially in June. And then the September reading was more or less at the same level as the June reading. So in a way, it's just validating that decline. And it was very close to our expectations internally too. So I think we feel good about that. Also, I would say it isn't, in my thinking, it's not the case that wages have been the principal driver of inflation so far. Although I think it's fair to say that as we go forward, as monetary policy becomes more important relative to the supply side issues I talked about and the unwinding of the pandemic effects, it may be that the labor market becomes more important over time too.
Hi, Nancy Marshall-Genser with Marketplace. Chair Paul, are you now as concerned about overshooting and raising interest rates too much as you
هل
are
أنت
about
خايف هلا إنه تزيد الفايدة أكثر من اللازم؟
So as I mentioned, I think for much of the last year and a half, the concern was not doing too much, not doing enough. It was not getting rates high enough in time to avoid higher inflation expectations become entrenched. So that was the concern. I think we've reached now more than 18 months into this. You can see by the fact that we have slowed down, although we're still trying to gain confidence in what the appropriate stance is. But you can see that we think, and I think, the risks are getting more balanced. I'll just say that they're getting more balanced. The risk of doing too much versus the risk of doing too little are getting more closer to balance, because policy is clear, I think, clearly restrictive at 5.25% to 5.5%. That range, if you take off a mainstream estimate of the expected inflation, take 1 year inflation, you're going to see a real policy rate that is well above mainstream estimates of a neutral policy rate. Now that's arithmetic. It doesn't really, what the proof is really in how the economy reacts. But I would say that we're in a place where those risks are getting closer to being in balance.
The proof is how the economy reacts. What are you looking at to be sure you're not overshooting?
Well, I think what we're looking at is, is inflation still broadly cooling? Is it sort of validating the path we saw over the summer, where inflation was clearly cooling and coming down? Now, we've seen periods like that before, and there hasn't been follow through. The data have bounced back. So what are we seeing? Are we seeing, is inflation still coming down? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, in the labor market, what we've seen is a very positive rebalancing of supply and demand.
بدناش نشوف توازن أكثر بين العرض والطلب.
And with labor demand still clearly very strong. When you have the kind of job growth we've had over the last quarter, it's still very strong demand. So, and you see wage increases coming down, as we discussed. but coming down, in a kind of gradual way. I think we want to see that whole set of processes continue.
Brian Mena, CNN. Do you think that has been any structural change in either consumption or in the job market that's pushing up consumption? You obviously saw the third quarter GDP figures, which were strong, and some economists have expected revenge spending to have fizzled out by now. So I'm kind of wondering if there's been any structural change in consumption.
لا شيء ما في شيء مهم والله ما في شيء
I
مهم.
wouldn't say there's been a structural change in consumption. I would say it's certainly been strong. And so a couple of things. We may have underestimated the balance sheet strength of households and small
بدك في
businesses.
الفيدرالية
That may be
يتمنى
part of it. There may be, we've
لساتوشي
been, like
ناكامورا
everyone else,
عيد
trying
ميلاد
to
ومش
estimate
عيد
the number
ميلاده
of
الزلمة ما حدا بيعرف
savings
عيد ميلاده ولكن
that households have
عيد
from the pandemic when they couldn't
إدراج الورقة
spend on
البيضاء
services really at
بالبيتكوين.
all, or in-person services. And, there can still be more of that than we think. Although at a certain point, we're going to be getting back to pre-pandemic levels of savings. We may not be there yet. So things
بوقت
are
محدد
clearly
رح
people
نرجع
are still
للمراحل
spending.
اللي كنا قبل
The dynamic has been
الكورونا.
really strong job creation with now wages that are higher than inflation in the aggregate anyway. And that raises real disposable income, and that raises spending, which continues to drive more hiring. And so you've had a really that whole dynamic has been, and also at the same time, the pandemic effects are wearing off, so that goods availability, automobile availability is better, or was better. I think it still is. And from a business standpoint, there are more people to hire, and there's more labor supply. So the whole thing has led to more growth, more spending, and that kind of thing. And it's been good. And the thing is, we've been achieving
الأمور عم تتحسن من
progress on
وقت
inflation in the middle of this.
الكورونا
So
وكل هالأمور هيك عم يحكي.
it's been a dynamic. The question is, how long can that continue? And
قد إيه رح تطول هالأمور؟ هذا السؤال هلا.
the existence of this second set of factors at this time, which is the unwinding of the pandemic effects, that's what makes this cycle unique, I think. And we're still learning. That took longer for that process to begin than we thought, and we're still learning about how it plays out. That's all we can do.
Daniel, the last question.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Daniel Avis from Agence France Presse. Just a quick question following up on an earlier one with regards to the Israel-Hamas conflict. The Fed's financial stability report said the Israel-Hamas conflict and the conflict in Ukraine pose important risks to global economic activity, including the possibility
هل
of
الحروب
sustained disruptions to regional trade in food, energy,
بين
and other
إسرائيل
commodities.
وبفلسطين وبين أوكرانيا وروسيا عم بيؤدي
if the war spreads to other countries in the region. I'm just wondering how the Fed is monitoring these developments.
عم بيؤدي لتصعيب على مهامك. أنت كيف عم بتراقبه؟ شو تحركاتكم على هالأمور؟
Could be if the conflict does spread to other countries in the region. Thank you.
I wouldn't want to speculate too much, but I'll just say so. Really the question there is, does the war spread more widely, and does it start to do things like affect oil prices in particular, since this is the Middle East we're talking about? The price of oil has really not reacted very much so far to this.
أسعار النفط بعد ما تحركت بشكل كتير كبير.
As the Federal Open Market Committee, our job is really to talk about, to understand the economy and the economic effects, and it isn't clear at this point that
نحن هدفنا نشوف شو تأثيره على الاقتصاد. لهلا ما في تأثير واضح.
is on track to have significant economic effects. That doesn't mean it isn't incredibly important and something for people to to take great, really important notice of, but it may or may not turn out to be something that matters for the Federal Open Market Committee as an economic body. But what the Financial Stability Report does is it calls out risks, and that's what it's doing, is calling out a risk of
بس إنه من عندهم في مخاطر
war in Ukraine,
ولكن
did
لهلا
have
بعد ما في
immediately
تأثير
very significant macroeconomic implications because of the connection to commodities. So
طيب ليه ما بيسألوا عن الصرف اللي عم يصرفه جو بايدن مثلا؟ ليه سألوا بس عن الحرب والنفط؟ يعني الصرف والأموال اللي عم بتروح ما رح تأثر؟ خلص مع المعلم جيروم باول. يعني ما حكي شيء جديد، بعد الامور نفسها مثل هذيك عم نراقب البيانات، بدنا نعرف شو بده يصير. تم تثبيت الفائده، هذا الايجابي. ما رح يزيد حاليا، ما برايي بقى هالسنه بقى تنزل، لانه الشهر المقبل الاجتماع المقبل رح يكون بديسمبر، بفتره عطلات، وقربنا كثير على السنه اللي جايه. بده جو بايدن يكون مبين بصوره جيده صراحه. من ناحيه هيك ما بعرف قد ايه رح يضغط على جيروم باول. بعرف ان سلطتين مختلفين، بس ولكن قد ايه رح يضغط على جيروم باول حتى ما يزيد الفوائد. في ضغط سياسي كمان. عفوا. وهذا هو كل المؤتمر. يعني ما في شيء جديد صراحة. مثل ما توقعنا صار تذبذبات بالسوق، صعود هبوط. هلا رجعنا على التذبذب مثل ما حكيت امبارح، قلت لكم هذا المتوقع وهذا اللي حيصير وهذا اللي عم بيصير. كثير بسمع كثير عالم عم يحكوا عن صعود وهبوط، ما حدا بيعرف 100% شو رح يصير. انا برايي ما رح نرجع نلاقي ما رح نشوف قاع جديد. يعني في كم شخص كانوا عم يحكوا هيك. انا برايي الشخصي، معقول اكون مخطئ، ما برايي القاع قطعناه. بدنا نشوف تصحيحات اكيد، ما في شيء بيضل طالع بشكل صاروخي، ولكن في ايجابيه بالسوق، وبنفس الوقت في سلبيه بالسوق من ناحيه الامور اللي عم بتاثر على السوق، من الحروبات، من هالامور. يعني في شغلتين عم بتصير عن سو لا اخي، انا ماني فول تايم تريدر جيسون. انا مستثمر بمدى طويل اكثر من فول تايم تريدر. ما معي وقت، دائما اكون عندي شغل كمان. صراحة ابتوس ما بعتقد في صعود قوي إلها. ليه قلت لكم هالامر؟ لانه في افراج كتير كبير بعد 10 ايام. هالافراج رح يعمل ضغط بيعي شوي. لذلك انا برايي، عفوا صراحة، أنا برأيي ما رح يكون في صعود قوي حاليا. مع الوقت أكيد مشروع قوي أبتوس، ولكن حاليا برأيي رح يكون مسار عرضي إذا مش هبوط لأبتوس، إذا عم تسألني. محمد أويسات. السهرة. بشكرك أخي كريم. عم يسألوني عن الذهب. الذهب دايما جيد بفترات الحروب بشكل عام. الذهب دايما جيد. الناسداك والاس ام بي 500 صراحة خليني بس شوف. خلينا نرجع على اليومي. شفنا ارتداد. هلا إذا بنحط ترند لاين، لا مش هلا، عفوا. أنا برأيي رح نشوف تصحيح بهذا الترند لاين ونرجع ارتداد. هيك بشوف أنا. ما بعرف، ممكن أكون مخطئ، بس تقريبا بهالمجال هيك. بلشنا مسار هابط بالاس ام بي 500 بشكل عام. هلا عم نعمل تصحيح خفيف، ولكن بشكل انا بحس رح نرجع نعمل ارتداد. بدها تواصل ارتفاع السولانا لوين ما حدا بيعرف 100% لوين بدها توصل. ما تنسى في عندك الإفراج عن عملات السولانا بالسنة بال 2025. يعني عندنا كميات كتير كبيرة من السولانا. في عالم بعدها خيفانة من هالموضوع، وفي بعض العملات اللي معقول إذا يمون مستيكينج وبيعوهم بأي ثواني يمكن يأثر على السعر. سولانا في عندها صعود، ايه في عندها امور ايجابيه عم تصير. ايه هلا المؤتمر خلص تقريبا. مش خلص لانه بعده باول منه بلش المؤتمر. يعني تم الاعلان عن اغلب الامور اللي رح يتم الاعلان عنها. قد ايه رح يكفي صعود ما برأيي بقى رح يكفي بشكل كتير كبير حاليا. هلا أكيد كمشروع بشكل غير. هل في مشاريع مثل تشين لينك تنصح فيها؟ في عندي عدة مشاريع أنا بحبذها لأنه بنى تحتية ولكن ما مثلا رندر هي أحدهم، ولكن ما بدي يكون الدخول فيها حاليا صعدت كتير بفترة قصيرة. أرويف أو فايل كوين برأيي لازم يكونوا جزء من البورتفوليو لأنه الستورج هن السباقين بهذا المجال. جراف جي ار تي كل هول عم بحكي لكم عنهم بنى تحتية رح يتم استخدامهم وهالشيء دائما جيد. how much you think top 10 market cap can be in the bull run؟ والله ما حسب الأوضاع ما فيني أقول لك 100%، ما بعرف. الدخول حاليا صح ولا لا؟ حسب إذا أنت عم تعمل مضاربة، إذا مضاربة سريعة الدخول كاستثمار ريسك فيرسز ريورد عالي للريسك سايد، أعلى الريسك سايد لأنه صار تسحيح قوي كتير صعودي. بنتظر أنا إذا بدي أدخل شوية تصحيح هبوطي قبل ما أدخل باستثمار حاليا، بس ولكن باستثمار مدى قصير. إذا عم تشتغل مدى طويل دي سي اي حيالله وقت بتشتري ما بيهمك. إذا عم تعمل دي سي اي على مدى سنين أو شيء هيك ما بيهمك أي ساعة. أنا ما رح طول عليكم شباب صراحة، ما عم بقدر فتح عيوني. بشكركم على المتابعة، بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب للشانل وتلحقوني على تويتر وتليجرام، وأنا بشوفكم أيضا فيديو جديد وماركت أبديت جديد. ثانك يو.